Welcome again to Cultural Savage, friends. I appreciate you sticking around. Today, I'm going to be talking with a new friend, Anna Evans. Anna is a survivor of domestic violence and stalking. She is the co-chair for the Crime Victims Advisory Council, CVAC. CVAC is a group of survivors of violent crime. They participate in trainings for those who work with victims, including those in the criminal justice system, as well as community organizations. They tell their stories to inmates in pre-release victim impact programs in the Colorado Department of Corrections. Anna has testified on several domestic violence bills which have passed into law. She's a certified yoga instructor, Reiki Master, and teacher with an emphasis on trauma recovery. She leads workshops with survivors to help them own their stories and use them to affect change. Anna is passionate about educating people about domestic violence and helping those who have experienced it learn to live well and peacefully. Anna, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. How are you?
Absolutely. I'm good. Thank you for having me, Erin. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. I've heard a little of your story. You've got a lot there, and I just got to say, you are a powerful person.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, you just are, and I love it. For those that don't know you, though, why don't you share a little bit of your story, kind of where you're at, how you got to where you are, just a little bit of you, so we know who you are.
Sure. Well, as the bio said, I'm a survivor of domestic violence and stalking. I grew up in a very abusive home, and so there was a lot of things that fell into place that I suppose just based on that trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Getting out of it, I had to leave the state for several years, went through an identity change as I was coming out of it. And here we are. I just reclaimed using my birth name about 5 years ago, which was really, really powerful.
Yeah.
I've worked again with CVAC as well as the Denver DA's office and Colorado legislation around creating stronger domestic violence laws. One of the laws we got passed was around making, are you ready for this? And no, it's not, wasn't legal before, but making non-fatal strangulation a felony. Yeah, I know it seems like common sense, but we got that passed.
Yeah.
Also multiple offender bills, so that guy, you can't just keep getting charged and having your charges reduced to misdemeanors. So we got that passed. And at the same time, working in the Department of Corrections to work with inmates who have experienced this, who have perpetrated these crimes against people,
Mm-hmm.
because they're the people we need to be talking to, talking
Yeah.
about generational violence, generational trauma, and how that continues to pass on. So a lot of times, I share the impact that what happened to me had on my daughter in order to help them understand that, like, you've got to, like, speak truth to power. Even if you did the wrong thing, like, you have the opportunity to be redeemed if you can speak truth to power and allow your children to heal, so that we break these cycles. It's not easy. It's hard work to break the cycles, whether you're the victim or the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And usually perpetrators are victims, so it's a rolling issue.
Yeah.
Through that, as I was doing my recovery, is when I started really looking for churches and reaching out. And a friend of mine sent us a sermon series around marriage from their church. And in one of the sermons, they called out domestic violence. And I had never heard that from the pulpit before, ever. Like, I had been church hunting, I had bounced around a lot of churches. But what I ended up finding was, it seemed like most of the time the pastors were very much like my dad was. Abusive, controlling, manipulative, and not always. I mean, I want to be fair. There were a lot of really strong people out there, but that really charismatic, narcissistic personality that makes you feel like you're crazy when you're asking questions. And so, having kind of gone through that and was a little bit disillusioned, I heard this and was like, yes. And then I went back and listened to like a whole year's worth of services, and I was in love with them. Um, and and so I listened while I was out of town, I think for about 2 years before
Mhm.
we moved back and I physically started attending.
Very
And
cool.
so that's kind of like, that kind of gets me up to my church experience.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I'm really curious. I mean, you talk a lot about trauma and things like that. We
Mhm.
know that the body holds trauma, like
Yes.
in itself. The body remembers trauma, it holds trauma, it triggers trauma. I'm interested though in your energy work with Reiki and stuff.
Uh-huh.
How does that interact with the physical body to help with trauma?
Ooh, okay. Well, the Reiki, I will say this: when I use the Reiki, it's usually in combination with personal coaching with that person, as well as usually some yoga practices
Hmm.
and meditation work. So there's a lot that goes into it. The Reiki energy work is really um, around. We all carry vibrations, so we know this. Like, you walk into a room and you can feel the mood in the room.
Right.
Those are our vibrations. Um, and so Reiki is really, for me in this context, it's really used to kind of try to raise those vibrations, to kind of shift the thought processes,
Mm.
to be more around empowerment instead of victimization, because we do, as survivors, tend to fall into some pretty significant victimization.
Yeah.
And I will say this: the reason I got started with it was because it was so effective for me. I do have a diagnosis of complex PTSD,
Hmm.
and so I struggle a lot with the PTSD. And so using these, I can use it on myself. I can use it to help other people, and it's been profoundly successful so far in combination with those other modalities.
That's really cool. That's really cool. As
And the other
you,
thing is too, I'm
oh yeah,
sorry.
go ahead. No,
The
go
other
ahead.
thing is too, is that a lot of times I will suggest to people that they get also either massage, like they're in a consistent massage therapy relationship with someone,
Hmm.
or rolfing, which is like, it's almost like you're releasing the trauma from the body. And so
Okay.
when they come back to me, then we can do the work around like letting that go.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Um, in your own experience, how has being, how do I even, I'm trying to think how to phrase this, because the idea of being trauma informed and knowing what trauma does to the body is sort of huge, I imagine, especially when you're dealing with victims of domestic violence and things like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
In your own recovery, how has the knowledge of what trauma is and what trauma does, how has that empowered you?
Wow, that's a huge question. Now, I'm a little unusual in that I think even when I was in it, I was already researching trauma,
Hmm.
and at that stage, I don't know that it was helpful, to be really honest with you. I think in some
Mm,
ways, it was almost more suggestive, and so I was picking up things that I might not necessarily pick it up if I didn't know. It's
right,
kind of crazy, but like, I wouldn't change it because I had to go through that process to get here.
right,
So
right.
it's kind of this balancing act of what does that look like. But now, and as I was working with the legislatures and working with CVAC and the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I also, some of the speaking we did, like we said, we work with people in criminal justice. So one of the probation department, I became really good friends with the woman who does the training there. So when she would invite me to do trainings, she actually would let me then sit in on the trauma certification courses and get the certifications,
Hmm.
in lieu of reimbursement, which, that's fine. But like, learning all of those things really helped me to understand the depth of the impact, because we never want to admit that somebody that we hated and hurt us as bad as they actually did, or that there are as many side effects or how many things are connected to that trauma,
Yeah.
because it impacts every part of your life. So I was able to take different evaluations. I was able to do different, like the ACEs, which kind of gives you, it asks you questions about what your trauma is and then gives you a score. And based on that, it kind of gives you determinations about what risk factors are in certain areas. So it's like I was able to look at that and kind of mitigate out, like, where am I struggling the most? And then work through that. But I think the most powerful, like, advice that I ever got was from an advocate who worked in the DA's office. And she worked in Denver County. We had cases in 2 separate counties, but she was fantastic. Like, she would answer any questions for me, even about the other cases where I wasn't getting the help that I needed. But and when I was in that place, I was nuts. I was crazy. Like, I would call her one time and be perfectly fine. Everything, I'm steady, even. And the next time I'd call her, I'd be a hysterical mess. And the next time I call her, I'd be raging, angry, yelling at her for something had nothing to do with her. But I just remember every time I called her, her first question was, "Are you safe right now?" Okay, yes, I'm safe right now, which grounded me, right? I could get my feet under me. And the next question was always, "What can you do today?" Because she understood, like, with that many cases out there, she's like, you can't deal with all of that all at one time. You have to find one piece of, whether it's trauma response, or whether, for me at that point, it was like, what court case are we dealing with today? Like, you can only deal with one thing at a time. Let the rest fall away and it'll come. Then tomorrow you deal with the next thing and the next thing. So, Erin, I've been so incredibly blessed to run into people and to be put into situations where I was just being lifted up all the time, whether it was by other advocates, or even, getting involved with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and being able to be educated and counseled through a lot of my own trauma. And I am very, very, very aware that that is very, very, very rare. Extraordinarily rare. Most times women, not even just women, people are recovering on their own, trying to figure all of this out, because even if you get involved with the criminal justice system, once that case is over, you're cut off too. So you kind of get through that, but then now you, more than likely, if you've actually gone through the criminal justice system, also have trauma from going through the criminal justice system on top of the trauma you had from the abuse. So really just trying to create programming and coaching around the survival of that, and then like letting it go and moving on, because now you're here. It's complicated.
I mean, I guess I never really thought about, like, the idea not just of having to explore your own trauma and name it, because a lot of times your trauma is normalized to you because it's what you've gone through. Like, oh, this is normal for me. Then you're telling stories to other people and they're like, what the hell? That is, but so not only are you trying to, like, suss out your own trauma, but you're trying to get through another traumatic event of having to face it again in a criminal justice system.
Yes.
What does all that do to the body?
Oh, Erin, I don't think I felt my body for like probably 3 or 4 years. There was so much logistical things to take care of. It was like there just wasn't time. There wasn't time. Let me rephrase that. It felt like there wasn't time. But I also look back now, while all that was going on, and I think we had talked about this before we got on to record, but there were 10 active cases in 2 different counties at one time before everything was digitized.
Yeah.
So if there were cases in one county, I had to go and get certified copies of all of those cases to bring to the other county, and vice versa. So it was like, I mean, it was that. And then this guy was everywhere. He was everywhere. He would show up at my work. We moved 3 times. I changed jobs multiple times, and he kept showing up. What we found out in the aftermath of it was that the private investigator who worked for the bondsman who kept bailing him out was the one who was following us. And he was telling him where we were at. So he lost his license. But in the moment, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense, not only not to me, but it doesn't make sense to the DAs who I'm trying to work with. It doesn't make sense to anyone. Like, how does he keep finding you? We're moving you. I mean, to the extent we had at one point that they had put it was called a juris monitoring system. So it was in my house, attached to my phone. He had an ankle bracelet. Like, if he came within 500 feet of that juris monitoring system, the alarms would go off. It would call 911. It would bring people, the police would show up and all of that. So this is what I'm processing. He showed up twice at my daughter's school, trying to pick her up there. I'm more worried about my daughter not being kidnapped than I am about taking care of myself in that moment.
Yeah.
So then coming out of it, your body starts responding, and it's, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, there's times when I'm exhausted and I feel like I just cannot even move. I couldn't function. There were times when I had pain, that unexplicable pain. I was pretty young. I didn't have really any reason to be in the kind of pain that I was in around my joints, muscle pain. And then, I don't know, you just kind of slowly start living again, right? You start a new job, you meet new people, and the cases are done, and I haven't heard from him in a while. So taking care of my daughter, reestablishing friendships with people that I had broken friendships with over this guy for whatever reason, making amends to people that I had hurt in the process, and just trying to reestablish normalcy again. And part of that was finding a church. For me, was like, I need to find a place where I'm in community and where I can share this, and then I can heal. Right? For me, that felt like a part of what the healing process was supposed to be.
Yeah. Was sharing your experience and your story, was it good for your body to share those stories?
It really was. So the first time I shared the story, I was in the other state that I had moved to. I was working with the domestic violence program there, and I had actually transitioned out of doing my work into helping facilitate some groups. So they asked me if I would be willing to go speak at the university. The nursing students were getting ready, or a cohort of new nursing students were getting ready to start their emergency room rotations, and would I be willing to go in and speak to them? And I was like, sure. And then I went home and went, fuck, what did I just do? Like, I have never spoken in public in my life. And here I am, okay, I'm going to come and talk to these professionals about at the time, I would have defined it as idiocy as opposed to victimhood, but that's where I was at. And then I was like, okay, but I made this commitment and I'm going to go do it. And so I did. They were really grateful and really thankful. And I was like, okay. And so there was a relief in it. And there was definitely a catharsis in it, because here I am training these nurses who may be able to help somebody better than any nurse ever helped me, because they were not trauma informed around domestic violence when I had gone to the hospital. And then when I moved back to Colorado, I, excuse me, I contacted that advocate that I had talked about earlier, and we just had lunch. I just wanted to tell her thank you and let her know what had been happening, because advocates don't usually get that. Like, usually you're there in the moment of crisis, and then you never hear from people again. So
Right.
I just wanted to tell her thank you. And so she told me about CVAC, and she was like, you have got to be a part of this. And so then before I knew it, we're speaking in front of judges, we're speaking in front of district attorneys, we're speaking in front of probation officers, corrections officers. And it was extraordinarily cathartic. It was really cathartic to do that. It was really cathartic to be in a different place and to be able to speak the truth about what worked when I was going through the process and what didn't work. So
I love that about what worked and what didn't work, like naming it, being grateful for what was good, naming what wasn't good, and
yes,
trying to
and then
change it.
having the opportunity to try to affect some change.
That's great.
Thank you.
So spirituality.
Yes.
How does spirituality play into this stuff? Like you talk about like your church experience in any community, and I mean that's one thing, but
right.
It's also a different, like your own personal spirituality. How did it play into recovery, into healing? And I mean, was it
yes and no. So in my mind, that was going to be the end all be all. Like, that's where I was going to find love. That's where I was going to find acceptance. That's where I was going to find healing. And, and there was a lot of that. Like, I don't want to diminish that was not true in a lot of situations. In small group situations, I met some amazing people. When I very first started going, I was still having court cases and that going on, but it was also a pretty large church in Denver. But it was in a small group that I met this woman who was, I don't even know, I wouldn't have been able to speak it then, but she was just Zen. She was calm. She was collected. Nothing freaked her out. And she just loved on people really, really well. And I remember thinking, that's who I want to be when I grow up. Like, I want to be like this woman. She listened really well. And not just to me, but to like everyone around her. She was you just wanted to be near her, you know? And so there was that. And again, other small groups. I've made amazing friends throughout the years in different situations. And the truth of it is that I have been profoundly disappointed with the white evangelical church in America. But I didn't know that. Like, and I think part of the reason I questioned so much was because of where I came from. Right? Like, I had been reading the Gospels before I started going to church. And then I remember going, who are they talking about? Because this is not the loving, compassionate, feed the poor, take care of the oppressed person that I've been reading about. Like, I think I've always been an activist in my heart, and then my story was kind of my trigger to take off on that race. But no, we went through several churches, and it just felt manipulative. It felt like it was always about like your behaviors and what you were doing, like never where your heart was at, never. And then watching people that I really cared about just being annihilated, LGBTQ folks. I'm going to say primarily LGBTQ folks, that I just watched them get crushed by the church and by the, hate the sin, love the sinner bullshit that they were always trying to feed us, because it's not any of that. And so but I am a stubborn person and I am a loyal person. And so I was determined that I was going to find the right church for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I did.
Yeah.
We eventually ended up at a really large evangelical church. And I did get remarried. We had a beautiful son together. And so now it's me and my now ex-husband and my son and my daughter who are, we're in this family unit. Things are going really well. He's doing well in his career. I'm a stay-at-home mom because my son already had some struggles that we were just felt like it was better for me to be available there for him. And then I volunteered at the church a lot. The women's ministry, the recovery ministry was huge. I was there every Friday night. I facilitated groups for different women in that context. And so we were very, very involved. The kids were in the youth group every week, just events. We were there. We were there.
Yeah.
And then my ex-husband had a significant mental breakdown. He was ill, medicine resistant and ill for about 7 years. 6 months into his illness, our son, who was 14 at the time, presented with major depressive disorder, also medicine resistant. So he was in the hospital a lot. I'll just say that. And then I'm going to leave that there because that is his story to tell.
Right.
However, at this point, I was on staff. I had been hired on. I worked in the recovery ministry. My mentor was now my boss. So all of these things were happening, and I was just coming apart at the seams because, I mean, that's a tough situation for anyone to have to go through, but then you throw in complex PTSD with that. And like the first thing I want to acknowledge was that I was a mess. I shouldn't have still been working there. I wasn't doing, the work wasn't going well. So I want to be really honest about what that looked like. But also there was no support for our family, like at all. My husband wasn't quite as involved because he worked, he traveled a lot for work. So he didn't have quite the same connections me and the kids did.
Right.
But my son, no one showed up. His youth group leaders, I think, showed up one time and then we didn't hear from him again. So I went to the head of the entire youth ministry and just explained to them what was going on, explained to them that like, my husband's sick, I'm a mess, this boy is hurting, and I need you all to show up. And so they did at the hospital one time. And then I didn't hear from him, he didn't hear from him, and I stopped fighting. I'm like, I don't have time. Like, I have to make sure I'm advocating for my son to make sure he's getting the care that he needs. But I don't, I'm not going to fight with you about showing up. Like, that's silly. And so that progressed. I was on there for a little while. My son was doing that. My ex was in his mess. And I remember talking with my boss, who was my mentor and friend before, and just telling her like how it just felt like everything was collapsing. We were losing our home. It was just messy. It was really ugly and messy.
Yeah.
And the response that I got was, well, just don't let anyone or anything steal your joy.
Oh,
what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? Thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
Just a complete unwillingness. And this was broader. Now, this very, very, very large church with a very, 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 very big bank account.
Yeah.
Very big. Did not offer services to the people. They would take them out. So if someone came and was struggling with needing help paying a bill or counseling or, really anything, there were different organizations that they were sent to in the community, different nonprofits. So then the nonprofits are carrying the weight of what, in my mind, the church should have been taking care of. right? There was money being taken away from other places. There's many layers to that, but so really just an inability to get down in the dirt with people, to like, and I'm not saying get down in there and drown with people,
Right.
but
No.
like at least get there so that you can start to hear the story and then help them up to walk out of that
Yeah.
pit. And that just was not my experience at all, with that. Now I gave my testimony at the recovery group and they loved that, Erin. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh. That was before all of the things had all fallen apart. They loved hearing about all of the horrible things I had been through right up until I was redeemed by Jesus and everything was fine. And you try to explain like, no, that's not really how this works. Like, it's
Yeah.
not, everything's not just fine now. That is still work every single day. And every
Yeah.
single day I walk with Jesus in that, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not, it's not just this miracle cure, which it seems like that's what everyone's looking for.
Yeah.
Now, while all this is going on, at the same time, this church is making a hard right turn into the whole idea of biblical masculinity. And so everything in me is turning over, right? Like as
Yeah.
this change is happening, it's like, and again, I couldn't have articulated it at that time, but it was like this betrayal, like a slow moving betrayal of like, I came into this to get away from this,
Yeah.
right? I came into this because you suckered me into believing that you actually cared about domestic violence.
Yeah.
You don't. You really don't.
Yeah.
But as they're taking this hard right turn, we're starting to see sermon series like the Man event, right? Who they're talking, or the Man series, just raising up men and raising up men. But specifically in that series, what I remember was that they put a guy up on the stage, up on the brilliant group, big screens, and he was perfect. Erin, he was, and I'm not kidding when I say this, he was a Navy SEAL. He was beautiful. I mean, he looked like he could have walked out of the movies, right? And
Right.
he's buff and he's this, and he's telling his story. And I don't ever want to diminish anybody's story. And he had been overseas serving and come back. And really, it was pathetic because it was, yeah, we had some communications issues and blah, blah, blah. But there was no depth to it. There was no,
Yeah.
he didn't talk about having PTSD and him and his wife were fighting all. I mean, it was really basically we had communications errors. And then we got together and we got a counselor and we got therapy, and now Jesus saved everything and everything's fine. And I remember looking around that room and going, you're setting everybody, this is going to make me tear up, and I'll tell you why in a second. You are setting everybody up in this room for failure.
Yeah.
Everyone. Because maybe there might be one man in this room who could live up to what you're putting up there. Maybe.
Yeah.
And now the expectation is for these girls that that's who they're supposed to find.
Mm.
Unhealthy on so many different levels, like just heartbreakingly so. This last year, at the end of 2018, I worked at a safe house for girls who have been trafficked. And there was, I think, some funding attached to that church. And so that's where they went if they wanted to go to church. And so I would go with them. And I just remember we got, at the end of the one series or one sermon we were there for, they talked about they were going to start the Man series next week. And I mean, I went back to the house and I begged the director, begged her not to let these girls go to that because it was so toxic and so sick.
Yeah.
These girls who had been abused beyond, oh gosh, terrible things have happened to them. Like that would set them up for failure so quickly. Like,
Yeah.
and thankfully, like they didn't send them during that time, but I just could not fathom having these kids go there.
Yeah.
During that.
Yeah, that
Nationalism.
just...
Yeah.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
How do you think Jesus embodies the opposite of
Oh,
toxicity?
Jesus is grace, and
Mm.
he's love, and he's knowing, right? Like Jesus is the liminal space, right?
Mm.
Jesus is the and. Jesus is. So when I do my coaching, one of the very first things that I try to encourage people to do is take the word but out of their vocabulary and replace it with the word and, because it changes everything.
Yeah.
It sounds crazy, but I'm telling when I find it usually takes them a little while, but usually when they decide to firmly go into that, it becomes the and is the liminal space. And so I would say that Jesus is and, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not black and white. It's not, because what I found out quickly was that the perception was that I was responsible for all the things that had happened to me. Right? It was my fault. It was my job now to figure out how to live this normal life with Jesus as the captain. Right? I mean,
Right.
it's crazy. But reading the Gospels and like, oh, Erin, God, there were nights when I would just read of, the woman at the well and
Yeah.
weep, just weep, because I mean, that's what it felt like, right? It was
Yeah.
her, and you're hearing me, and why would you throw me scrap? Like and I imagine him saying, I'm just throw scraps to the dogs. I'm like, but I'm hungry. I'll take it, right?
Yeah.
I'll take the scraps so I can figure out how to do this better, how to be better. Jesus is empowering and lifting people up, men, women, children. I mean, the sick, the oppressed, like, and I'll tell you, even, before I ended up having to completely leave the church, like I wasn't really going to the big room anymore, to the big services on Sunday.
Yeah.
Like Friday night in the recovery program with those folks who were like doing the work,
Yeah.
who have been through shit that many of the people in the big room couldn't even wrap their brains around.
Right.
Like, that's where I wanted to be, because that's where Jesus was at, right? The big concert in the other room and the charismatic, narcissistic leaders standing up on stage telling us all how we should be and how we should live. That's not Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? Jesus is over here in this smaller group of people who are wounded and bleeding and hurting and are just looking for someone to sit next to them and listen and then put their hand out and help them up.
Yeah.
Right? That's Jesus. And
Yeah.
I didn't find that in any of the churches, honestly. Maybe a few individuals, like I said, in
Sure.
small groups
Sure.
or in smaller community space. But like corporately, mm-mm. It was all about keeping people in their place, making sure their behavior looked like what we think it should look like. There was nothing to do with heart. Nothing to do with heart.
That's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Until I left there.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the movement into it. One of my jobs at the big church was to process applications for counselors who wanted to be on our referral list.
Mm-hmm.
And so did this. It was pretty mundane. There wasn't anything exciting about it. But I was processing through one. I took the application to my boss, and she just immediately was like, no, like they have one of those weird meditation labyrinths, and so no. And I was like, okay, that's weird, but not my place, not my job. I'm just putting the application to the side. When it all came apart, all of those things had happened. This move into the biblical masculinity, as well as to a really significant nationalism. At that point, I wouldn't have called it white nationalism. I would now.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have articulated then as white nationalism, but now I would. To the extent that our last team building was, they took us to a shooting range to shoot automatic weapons. And I have pictures. I can send you pictures if you'd like. But it happened. And it was just this, like, it was everything that I wasn't. Right. It ended up like it's like we diverged into completely opposite ends of this spectrum. And there was no bridge for it at that point.
Yeah.
So I had been listening to some sermon series by Nadia Bowles-Weber.
Yeah.
And she's at House for All Sinners and Saints in Denver. And here's a funny thing, like we had avoided going forever because they had posted on their website, like, please no tourists, because
Yeah.
it's a pretty small congregation. And so we were just like, we don't want to interrupt, like this is their space. But when we did finally show up, they're like, no, we would have loved for you to come. We're talking about tour buses would show up and like offload during a service. And so there would be more literal tourists than there were congregation members. And they were very kind and sweet about it. But what it was, this was a definitely way more progressive church than I had ever been at, inclusive, LGBTQ inclusive. And so that was a new experience. And the very first week we were there, the next weekend there was going to be a silent retreat. And I was like, I need to be at that.
Yeah.
Because mind you, like, I know we've kind of bounced around a little bit, but at this point, my husband was still a mess. We had just lost our home. We were living with friends, and my son was in the hospital.
Yeah.
So silence was like calling to me to find a place to be. Because the activity of the old church, the do more and you'll feel better, was not working.
Right.
And so I talked to the pastor, not Nadia, but the associate pastor, and he was like, you're going. He's like, I don't care, here, we got you signed up, you're going. So we went, we got to the retreat center, and I opened my door and I looked up, and the first thing I saw was a walking labyrinth. And I went and walked the labyrinth. And I know it sounds so small, but it felt so rebellious. It felt so liberating to just go walk and pray in this place out in the open and in nature. Hi, buddy.
Thinking.
Okay, bud. Yes.
I'm flying.
You're flying.
You're
That's
awesome.
amazing.
Kindergarten.
Hey, can you go out for a minute? Thank you. That's my little one. Love him.
He's phenomenal. What's his name?
His name is Atticus.
Atticus. Ooh, that's a good name.
Yeah, I like
That's a
him.
really good name. Okay.
So you found, and it's interesting because your act of rebellion was an act of embodiment because you walked. It was a walking meditation. I love labyrinths for that. They're in your body meditation, not meditation that we think of like going spiritual and ethereal, but it's very bodily oriented.
Well, and then if you're if it's outside, you're out in nature, your feet are connected with the ground, you're surrounded by just this splendid beauty.
Yeah.
And it's just all embodying. So there was this silent retreat. There was a lot. We did several sitting contemplative prayer practices. And I remember, like, you asked about the physicality of it.
Yeah.
Up until that point, like from when my husband first had his breakdown to right there, I felt like I was on fire. like all the time. Like I'm sure my blood pressure was up, but like it was a heat, and I don't know, it's that panic heat, right?
Yeah,
Like you
yeah.
feel that panic heat. And there was I couldn't calm it down. I couldn't, like, I felt like everybody was judging me for, these things that I had no control over. And so sitting through these meditations, the very last one we did, the very last contemplative prayer, it was like 30 minutes long. I remember sitting there and just going, this is how you find peace when the whole damn world is falling apart. And in the quiet, right? And I remember thinking this, in the quiet, that's where God is. He wasn't in the thunder. He wasn't in the storm.
Yeah.
He was a whisper. And unless you can get still enough to hear the whisper, you can't hear him.
Yeah.
And what I heard was him saying to me, I love you. You're here. Go figure out who you are. Right?
So good.
And so that was the beginning of my big spiritual journey, I guess.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. This is my favorite question to ask. This is my absolute favorite question. In light of everything we've talked about, embodying trauma, Reiki being part of your healing, how you use that, who Jesus is, I mean, all of this stuff. What does that do to your articulation of good news to people? Like somebody that needs hope, what does that do to your articulation of hope for them?
I think here's what Christians miss so many times, is that in the beginning, when somebody is really traumatized and really hurt, we are Jesus. We are the embodiment of hope, or fear, or judgment, or whatever we put on that person, right? So when someone comes to me or is recommended, however I get connected with them, the first thing I need to do is just listen to their story, not just their story, the way they're telling it, where they're telling it from, where they are specifically in their lives right at this moment. Like, is this someone who, say, is an upper middle class housewife who is in her home, and is that, or is it a woman of color who is living in a shelter with her 2 kids? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, the dynamics matter so much. And what I've tended to see in the church and in the system is that upper middle class woman, who's here, it's not her fault. We're going to get her all the help she needs, even though she has the resources to get all the help she needs on her own.
Right.
Whereas the woman who's in the shelter, regardless of color, honestly, the woman who's in the shelter with her children, there are very few resources available for them to actually get the trauma-informed help that they need. And again, once that case is done, so is the help.
Yeah.
So, listening to context, listening to their level of trauma, and feeling them. I don't know how to explain that any more than you feel people, you know if someone's okay, if they're not okay, if they're ready to do certain work. And those are, right, the feelings we have. I would apply that as far as the Reiki goes to those vibrational kind of energies. Understand, like, some people who very first start meditating and doing contemplative prayer practices. I had one girl who we started with 2 minutes because she couldn't get to 5 for like a month, right? So the embodiment, and I think that's what Jesus did, was like, he paid attention to the whole story. He didn't need to hear it. He knew it because he's Jesus. But like, if you pay attention, if you are trauma informed and you are willing to put yourself out there to do this work, it is incumbent that we listen first. and that we reach out. And that means that it kind of goes back to, I'm gonna crawl down in here with you, and I'm gonna sit next to you, and I'm just gonna listen. I am just going to hear what you have to tell me. And I'm not going to be horrified. I'm not going to be shocked. I'm not like,
Right.
I promise, you know, this, and I tell people all the time, survivors, is like, you're not going to tell me anything that's going to surprise me. You're just not, you know, given the work that I've done within the criminal justice system, even if I haven't experienced it myself, I know what people are capable of. Like, my mantra of sorts is that after doing this work for 20 years, I am no longer ever surprised by the capacity that people have to be able to hurt each other.
Yeah.
But I am stunned daily at the resilience that people show to be able to recover and heal well. And if Jesus can be a healthy part of that conversation, then it's exponentially more so.
Yeah.
If the Jesus presented to them is abusive and judgmental and telling them what they need to do and what they have to do and how they need to be, that it's going to be exponentially worse for that person and their faith.
Yeah.
Did that answer the question? I feel like I kind of wandered off.
No, that is so true. And just the idea of, before we present, we listen. And then when we present with compassion.
Yes.
And feeling them and empathy, and don't let it steal your joy.
Right.
But like, what do you need? How can I help? Even just like, do you need a meal? Do you need me to take you to Pizza Hut because you are tired and you are strung out on whatever? Do you need, what do you need? Yeah. No, I
100 times we've done this. I can't tell you how many small fundraisers we've done. One client of mine was going to lose her service dog, and it was $120, which is nothing, but it was right after COVID started, so everyone was not sure. You know, we raised the money so she could keep her dog, and that one little thing, that finding that $120 for her to be able to keep her dog, changed whatever trajectory was happening, right? Because that dog gives her comfort, that dog gives her hope, that dog gives her companionship. I can't imagine what this girl, how she would have processed through, especially after COVID, being by herself with no companionship. And so like those small things, buying the meal, like actually showing that you care about their material comforts, brings comfort, but it also brings trust. And it also opens the door for them to share a little bit of their story, even the shameful parts of the story, right? Because the shameful parts of the story, the vulnerability, are what's necessary for healing to happen. So how do we open those doors? And I think that you're right. That's a huge part of it. Like, again, right? Jesus is the liminal space. A meal is not just a meal. A meal is physical sustenance and spiritual sustenance and friendship and companionship and love and welcoming, right? You are welcome at my table. I want you at my table. I want to hear your story.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Well, Anna, you have been an absolute pleasure to talk to. This has been so good.
Thank you.
If people want to connect with you, where can they find you on social media?
Okay, on social media, they can find me just under Anna Evans on Facebook. I'm not really big on Instagram, so there's that. On Twitter, it's at It's Always And.
At It's Always And.
Okay. And I'm going to forewarn you about Twitter. Like, I am an activist at heart, and that's where I do my activism. So this is not the same conversation we're having here, but I welcome people to come in here because, you know, what's happening now in the world is, the night 2016, I remember looking at my ex and going, they are marrying this abusive man, and the rest of us are the stepkids who are getting dragged in to what's about to happen. And that's exactly how it's played out. Like,
it has.
he is not special. He is just another abusive dude who happened to get a lot of power and money.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
just forewarning on that.
That's okay. For real hardcore activism, go for Twitter, because
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, we need activists now. We really do.
Mhm.
So I applaud you for doing that. Well, thank you
Thank you.
again so much.
Of course.
This has been an absolute pleasure. And hopefully we can have you on again sometime. How does that sound?
I would love to come back and talk with you. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you.